welcome to What If I Say Yes? How are you today?
I'm doing well. It's a little humid, but it's midsummer, so it's wonderful to be here. I love the way that you are honoring your brother with this project.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Michael, let's begin with you telling the audience, who are you?
You mentioned the various possibilities for this. I'm a human being on Earth in the year 2024, but in terms of my core identities, I would say it starts with family, father, husband, son, brother, uncle, in-law. I try to be my best self to all of those people in my life. And uh, outside of that personal sphere, the who am I question, I think, is is teacher. I formally am a teacher at the college level at Ithaca College, environmental history and environmental humanities, both of which interests flow out of my personal commitments to climate action and environmentalism that goes back to my own college years. But I try to fill the role of teacher or learning facilitator in all aspects of my life, and co-learner as well. I think teaching is as much about learning from other people as it is imparting something to them. Um, and I guess I would add one other thing is that I am an avid bicycle rider,
Oh,
cyclist.
yes.
It's a very important part of my identity.
Mhm.
I didn't even own a car until I was almost 40 years old, and I hope to get to a point where I'm car free again, at least as an owner. I ride recreationally, I ride for transportation, I rode competitively for a few years in my 20s and 30s. So that's a symbol of my interaction with the world is the bicycle that you often see me on.
Yes. Um, and it's also amazing because when I learned that you, for example, biked to Ithaca College from where you live, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
steep ride. I couldn't believe it. Like Carlos told me that you were doing that and was like, who in the right mind would do that? Well, Michael, because of your commitment.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is both part of the ethos of trying to use a bicycle to get around, but it's also a great way to stay fit and oxygenate my brain every morning before I start my day here. So yeah, it's about 160 meters or about 500 feet of elevation gain. So I've done the math. It's hundreds of thousands of feet and tens of thousands of meters over the years of making it up the hill. But the
Oh,
benefit is that it's all downhill going home, so that's nice.
once you're tired of teaching and doing everything, then you just go. Okay, very nice. Now, tell the audience, how is it that we know each other?
Yeah, so we know each other primarily through my introduction to your husband Carlos, who I met very shortly after he started moving into his office, which is right next to mine here in the Muller Faculty Center at Ithaca College. And he and I immediately hit it off on a number of levels. Intellectual, our shared love of baseball. He is a stealth historian, even though he's in the politics department. So we had a lot of conversations around that. And it wasn't long. I don't remember the exact moment, but it wasn't long before he introduced me to you and Maya as the dear parts of his inner circle of family. Um, and very quickly our two families became friendly and friends. And I remember vividly within, I don't know, a year or two of meeting, you came up and helped us make grape juice at
Yes.
my mother-in-law's, and then yeah, I mean, you've since become good friends with my wife Kristen. So I would say those are the various circles that have brought us together over the past, what, now 11 years. I think 2013 is when I think you moved here, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
This summer, 11
yeah,
years.
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't remember exactly the day I met you, or if I met you at Ithaca College. But I do remember when I met you and Kristen. It was at the Science Center.
Ah, yeah.
And so that may have been the first time, I don't know. But then I remember Carlos had told me that you two were homeschooling your kids.
Mm.
And so when I finally met you, I started asking you and Kristen questions because that was so new to me. I couldn't believe how someone could do that. Especially because Maya, when we came here, Maya couldn't go to any preschool programs. They were reducing the number of groups or something. So I was her kindergarten. Well, no, I was her preschool before kindergarten. So for me, it was like, I'm gonna need time. So when she goes to school, I'm gonna be so happy. And then just hearing about homeschooling and all the things you were doing, it was so interesting because I hadn't had that experience before. And yes, we became friends very quickly. When years later, when my brother Hector passed away, I remember having gone to Kristen to just talk, and it became just a crying session. I just told everything that had happened that summer with his passing. And I was just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing with Kristen in your kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yes, both our relationships with each other and with Kristen and Carlos and your kids, your amazing kids, has been
Mm.
one of the very special gifts this city gave us. So
Well, thank you.
yes, that's and I sent you the invitation to participate in this project, I think last year.
Yeah.
And then for one thing or another, we couldn't schedule it, or we scheduled it and then I had to cancel, or then you couldn't. And so finally, a year after, we're here.
Yeah, I'm very glad. Yeah.
But also before going into the what if I say yes moment, I want you to explain why last year, when I sent you the invitation, you said, yes, I can do it, but I don't want to do it through Zoom or via Zoom.
Uh-huh.
It
Yeah.
was
Well, I mean, I think like many people, especially in professional realms, Zoom became pretty much compulsory for a year or two, including for me as a classroom teaching tool. And so part of it is just I came to really dislike it because of the hangover from that year or two. And I think virtual video communication tools like this are useful. I mean, I used Skype periodically before the pandemic, before anyone even knew about Zoom, especially when we traveled and we were in Nicaragua and other places, wanting to just say hi to family and to see their faces. So I'm not, averse to it altogether. But I think that period of our collective history reminded me of how much I cherish and need connection with people in person. And I just the mediated nature of a conversation over a video stream is just very different. And so at the time when you asked me, I was thinking it would, yeah, I don't know why I mean I haven't changed my mind in that regard, but it just is. I realized in looking at some of your other entries that it would be one of those things is not like the other once you put it up, and it's a perfectly adequate mechanism for doing the work you're doing. So, but I guess just I'll put in my personal plug that I think all people should recognize that this should be a complement to, but never a substitute for, actual human interactions. We're social primates, and we can't change that. Some people are more introverted, some people are more extroverted, but I think there are very few people who don't need the human connection that comes from, being able to make eye contact and put your hand on someone else's, or whatever is possible. And so that's probably a longer answer than you were looking for, but that's the basic reason.
No, it's perfect. And I understood that, and actually for today. So just this morning, you sent me an email confirming that we were meeting, and you also said, and by the way, if you want to do it via Zoom, I will be okay with that too. So before that, I was already planning what things I needed to bring to your office, and then I had asked Carlos yesterday. He went to the office yesterday or the day before. He had to check his laptop and if the camera and the microphone were working, and so I was already planning on doing this live with you, because this is not only, I mean, the what if I say yes part, it's not only about you, my guests, it's also on my side. So whenever the guests ask me something, I mean, if I can do it, then it's a yes.
Yeah.
So I was all ready to do that. But then when you said, well, we can also do it via Zoom, I said, well, okay, then we're going to stay, and then we'll go out and do other things later on. The only one who got disappointed by the change of plans was Maya. Because she wants to stay in the apartment sometimes without us, like feeling independent, and like she can have her own time for herself. And so we had already told her that this morning we were going to leave for the interview and then to run some errands. And so I came back to her room and said, well, change of plans. We're going to still leave in the afternoon, but you're going to have to wait until I finish my interview. So anyway, well, Michael, let's begin with, when was that moment in your life when you asked the question, what if I say yes? You answered yes, you said yes, and did something.
So I have a preliminary to my own moment, and it was a moment when someone else said yes that completely changed the trajectory of my life, that in some ways enabled the yes moment that I want to talk about. And I think most people probably have more than one of these moments in their life where retrospectively you look back and you think, wow, that episode, that conversation, that moment was a real inflection point, that if something else had happened, my life goes in a potentially radically different direction. So when I was a junior in college, I was an English major as an undergraduate, and I was taking a history course to fulfill a general education requirement. And it was dreadful. After a week, I was realizing I just did not want to be there. And at the same time, my brother, who was also at the same institution, was taking a different history class that he just raved about. After 1 week, he said, this is the most amazing class I've ever taken. And so well into week 2, so long after, any kind of formal dropping and adding usually happens, I decided I had to give it a shot. So I went to this professor's office. This was, pre-email or anything. You had to go. Knocked on his door. I mean, he didn't know me at all. And I made my appeal. I said, can I switch to your class? And I think it was late in the week. I said, by Monday, I will make up every piece of work that you've assigned so far, and demonstrate that in whatever way you want, if you'll let me do this. And I could tell he hesitated. I told him my brother was in the class so I can get notes. But it was a big ask, honestly, now that I've been in that role for 24 years and had students come to me. And he said yes. And that set me down the path to becoming a historian. it set me down the path to where I ended up getting my first graduate degree at Villanova University, which, as I'll talk about in a minute, was really important to my yes moment in some ways. And I'm still very good friends with him. He's a huge baseball fan, lives in Philadelphia, still plays in a league
Oh,
for 60 and older.
wow.
Metro Philly has this league for older baseball players.
Nice.
It's incredible. Yeah. So I'm jealous of that opportunity that he has. Mark Galicchio is his name. I should mention it. He's quite an esteemed historian. He co-wrote a book that won the Bancroft Prize a few years ago, which is the premier prize for a U.S. history book. Anyway, so fast forward a couple of years, I finished my degree. I'm not thrilled about the idea of going to graduate school in English at that point. It was very theory oriented, and that wasn't my thing at all. So I took a year off, and then still didn't do anything. I substitute teaching in my hometown. I was kind of spinning my wheels, frankly, and getting pretty desperate to leave. And I'd put out feelers for all sorts of opportunities to just go. And one of them was through a pastor in my grandparents' church. And I spoke with him briefly, and he put me in touch with a Habitat for Humanity chapter in Mississippi. And in November of 1991, I got a phone call from the director of that Habitat chapter, the construction supervisor. Joe Carton was his name. And he said, I hear you're interested in coming down and that you have a little bit of support from this church down here. Interviewed me a little bit. I had very little in the way of construction experience at that time. It was probably clear in retrospect that I was just sort of grasping at anything to make a change in my life and kind of get going with my young adulthood. And after he talked to me for a while, he said, well, I can offer you, up to a few months of being an assistant construction person here. And it'll be very basic, living in an old converted school building, and, helping other volunteers. And
for people who don't know what Habitat for Humanity is, just give a brief explanation.
Yeah, sure. So it's an organization that was founded in the late 1970s as a one approach to housing insecurity. So Habitat for Humanity is a global organization that builds houses in communities that need affordable housing, but it's designed on a sweat equity model. So families that are eligible for these houses, before their own house is even under construction, usually they are working on other people's houses, which both invests them in the process and then in their own house, but also provides them skills for being able to maintain the houses. And so they're very low to zero interest loans through the funding that the national organization and local chapters give. So it's a great organization. I didn't know much about it other than that Jimmy Carter, the former US president, had worked for them and been kind of a PR person for their work. So he made the offer. I thanked him. I said, let me give it some thought. And I'll call you back in a day or two. I don't remember the exact amount of time. And I said, yes. I said, I want to try this. And there must have been enough hesitation in my voice that when I got to Mississippi a couple months later, I got very beginning of 1992 in January, on the big calendar where he logged all of, who was coming, who was leaving, and different groups. For me, Michael Smith arrives 1 to 3 months. We hadn't even talked about but he could probably tell that maybe I wasn't gonna do this for very long, or
it was Michael Smith ?
Pretty much. but that was an enormous pivot point in my life. Saying yes to that opened up not only a view and an experience that illuminated some of the worst aspects of American history and culture in terms of the profound inequalities around race in that particular place. Then and now and for hundreds of years, it's very much sort of written on the landscape. And that still haunts me, because the yes led me to that awareness, and it really is a big reason why I became a professional historian. But a month after I arrived, Kristen walked through the front door of that same old school building that was the communal living for all of the volunteers. And in retrospect, you sort of you want to dress it up that angels were singing and there was a glow behind her head, and it wasn't. I have to admit, it wasn't like that, but there was an initial and instant connection. I mean, we both realized that, and have talked about it since. So that yes led to both my now 32 plus year relationship with her, and led me to my profession. And I'm profoundly grateful for both of those things, even as I have to acknowledge that I think a lot of people who do long-term volunteer work like this, and in the Peace Corps is another example of this, it often, you end up feeling like you were more of a beneficiary than the people that you were ostensibly there to help and serve. I've been back one time since leaving, and it hasn't changed much.
How long did you stay?
So I stayed from about almost 5 months. I left at the end of May.
Okay.
Of that year.
Can you describe what happened during those 5 months?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because it can allow me to circle back to the yes moment someone else offered me. Yeah, so the first month I was there, I very quickly realized that there are a lot of really important skills that one should have in life that I didn't, in terms of just being able to build stuff and read a blueprint. And so it was amazing in that regard to just sort of have a very generous and patient mentor helping me learn skills, and then very quickly being asked to teach them to other people. I mean, that's the model for Habitat for Humanity. So we had groups come for 1 to 2 weeks from all over the country who would stay and contribute to the construction process. So I got to meet people from all over, and at the end of February, groups of college students, which I was only 2 years removed from college myself, started coming for their spring break trips. And so for 5 weeks, we had every week, at least one, sometimes 2 groups from colleges and universities around the country, which was great fun, because in the evenings we would, socialize playing cards or just.
And groups of how many students?
It ranged from, at the low end, maybe 9 or 10 to as many as 20.
Oh, wow. A lot of them.
Yeah. So we had the school building. It wasn't like a one-room schoolhouse. It was an older school built after the war, probably 1950s, that had, they'd consolidated that school district. So the small village, the Coahoma, Mississippi is the name of the village. It didn't have its own elementary school anymore after, I think, the early to mid 80s. And so the building was just sitting there. And so Habitat bought it and then converted 2 of the classrooms into like dormitory style accommodations for groups of volunteers. And then some room, they divided the old classrooms into smaller rooms for the longer term volunteers to have more private places in the back.
But in that case, it was more like remodeling the building to
Well, I mean, that had all happened before I got there. They had done that in preparation to be, I mean, they were building at any given time, um, you know, 6 or 7 houses in various states of construction. They
Oh,
were designed to, they were replacing in many cases housing that still did not have, in a couple of cases, indoor plumbing in 1992 in the United States.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay.
These were 19th century shotgun shacks that were just barely sheltered. And they were also designed to be very inexpensive. They were built with mostly volunteer labor, of course, and then the materials and design was intended to be possible for people to make their mortgage payments. Again, these were generally interest-free loans on the sort of episodic employment and government assistance that a lot of people who were the recipients of these houses could afford. So it was very
The
striking.
volunteers for Habitat for Humanity were in the school, the old
Yes.
building.
Hmm.
But from there, you went out to help with different projects, building houses.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got confused. I thought you were also doing work in the school, kind of remodeling the building, but no, that was a
I,
different thing.
I think some early volunteers had done that, 2 or 3 years before I got there.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so it was an education in all kinds of ways. And
So your responsibilities throughout those 5 months, what were they?
so we would have staff meetings once a week and kind of lay out the plan for the coming week and who the volunteers were and kind of divvy up tasks. So maybe one week I would be in charge of a crew that was framing a house. Maybe another week it would be siding or painting or hanging sheetrock or one period I got pulled off for a couple of weeks to help with a sort of ancillary project, which was building greenhouses for a hydroponic tomato operation that was going to be employment for a few people in the community. So I was, helping pour footers for the hoops for the greenhouses and pulling plastic and that sort of thing. But mostly it was working on these houses and just trying to interact with the community. It was very, in retrospect, I was so naive about many things at age 23, but
Like
this was
what? You were
well,
like,
just the character of history in this place. Like the entire village, with the exception of a couple of people, was Black, descendants of enslaved people, who were still being marginalized by all sorts of systems, economic, social, political, and who nonetheless were incredibly welcoming, although probably justifiably suspicious a little bit in retrospect. And so yeah, I mean, I felt like I connected in some meaningful ways with people, but I think they probably also rightly thought of me as a outsider who was fulfilling some desire to do good in the world, which is true, but it also, there's an indictment there that I reckoned with a little bit later, that that you know authentically reciprocal acts of generosity are hard, and there's a power relationship in an environment like that even if the intentions are all really good, I think is unavoidable. And in retrospect, thinking of almost exclusively white privileged college students coming down who were doing this on their spring break, right? So there are a lot of other things that would be quite self-indulgent that these students could have been doing instead. I think they also were very well intentioned, and we did have reflections in the evenings about what people were experiencing. But I don't know if there's a better way to do it, but that's a little thing that still gnaws at me a little bit. But while I was there, this would have been probably in late February, I called this mentor of mine, Mark Galicchio,
Mhm.
who after my year of taking classes with him and planning to become a history minor, actually, told me at the end of my junior year that regrettably he had taken another job at Villanova University. And so I sort of shelved the idea of history being something I wanted to pursue formally. And I called him just to say, tell him about my experience and catch up. And he said, Michael, if you're interested, Villanova University has a terminal master's degree program. And I think you'd be a perfect candidate because it would, having not taken a lot of undergraduate history, it would allow you to kind of get caught up if you wanted to do a PhD in that discipline. And your track record is still really good. So I think you could even, just not being a history major, I think you could not only get admitted, but get some research assistantship aid.
Mhm.
And I sort of, and at that point, I'd known Kristen for a few weeks, and I knew she was, after this stint in Mississippi, was going to be going. She had 3 semesters of her undergraduate degree to finish up in Providence, Rhode Island. And
Mhm.
I was already thinking, I want to be as close to Providence, Rhode Island as I can. But she was also, pretty clear early on, like, I want you to be close, but not too close. You're not going to move to Providence, are you? With nothing to do. So all of that was sort of, stewing around. And so I did it. I applied. I think that, I had a couple weeks to put together my application, which at the time, was all by paper.
Really?
And so that worked out as well. It's chapter, I don't know, 10 of 100 in my very charmed life. Um, and so I got in and I got enough of an assistantship that I didn't have to borrow hardly any money to do this. And it was also happily, an 8-hour train or bus ride from where Kristen was going to be. So that's why that yes moment is so important, because who knows, we would have maybe figured it out from a longer distance. But I think that confluence of things from November of 1991 through May of 1992, boy, it's a very consequential period of my life for sure.
So it's a chain of yeses that began with the yes to go with Habitat for Humanity.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
the initiating thing. And then, of course, some I don't know, both stated out loud and implied yeses as Kristen's and my relationship evolved into something very rich and deep, and a commitment that we wanted to endure. And then, also like the yes that grew out of that, Mark's willingness to let me into his class that started my graduate career in history. So there's just this really pretty powerful intertwining of my personal and academic and eventually professional lives in all the decisions that flowed from the yeses of that period. It's fun to talk about it this way. I like the way you're framing all of these inquiries.
So I know you kept being involved with Habitat for Humanity. I know that you and Kristen and later your kids went to other places to work with them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
What
So
has been your involvement with Habitat for Humanity since then?
Kristen, for sure. So we both went back for the spring break period of 1994, kind of reprising our roles as construction supervisors. Went back to the Mississippi location. And at that point, I had finished up my master's degree, and we were trying, and she had also graduated or finished up in December of 1993. So we were kind of thinking about what we might do next. And someone else that we had met, another long-term volunteer at that Habitat project in Mississippi, happened to call Kristen and ask if she was interested in applying for an assistant construction supervisor paid position for the Louisville, Kentucky Habitat chapter, which she did and got. So we moved to Louisville, Kentucky in the spring of 1994 and spent the rest of that calendar year there. And so she became professionally involved with Habitat both then and then.
What were you doing then?
Oh gosh, so I taught one class as an adjunct at a community college. I worked the graveyard shift in a bakery run by two.
What's the graveyard shift?
8 p.m. to 4 a.m.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this was a Parisian style bakery started by two Bosnian refugees. And this, of course, was right in the middle of the Yugoslavian Civil War. And so that was interesting and meaningful to do work like that on a shift like that. It gives you an appreciation for what a lot of people have to do just for their whole lives. I worked in a restaurant and I worked at a bookstore, sometimes all at once. And then I eventually, moved mostly into the restaurant and only worked one shift at the bakery, but it was great.
Let me just make a parenthesis. What do you do at a bakery from 8 to 4 a.m.?
Make bread. So bread is needs to be fresh and ready to go by the time a bakery opens. I think they opened at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. So the process takes time. So the dough was usually already made in this giant container when I got there. And so then it was just shaping it into loaves, dozens of them. And then in sequence, putting them in the proofing room, which was a kind of steam injected warm space where they would rise, and then into the oven. And so it was just sort of.
So how many hours before the bakery opens you have to put them in the oven?
You want most of it baked by the time I was usually pulling the last bread out by the time the pastry chef arrived at 3 a.m.
Oh my goodness.
Because the pastries had to be even fresher and it had to be available to him to bake the pastry. So I would usually help him with the prep work for the croissant and other pastries in my last hour and make sure the bread was all ready to go. And then he would take over and I would go home all covered in flour and sometimes shower off, sometimes just collapse into bed.
So you were teaching, you were at the bakery, you were at the bookstore doing what?
I was just a clerk at the bookstore. That job only lasted about a month because it just was incompatible with the scheduling of these other things. And it was also, we didn't have a car. So it wasn't up a hill like here, but it was probably 6 miles each way to ride. And this was summer in Louisville, Kentucky. And so.
And you were also at a restaurant?
Yep. And then
as a waiter or what?
No, I did pretty much everything but wait tables. I did some baking for them, but I did prep work. I did line work. I washed dishes. I complained with the rest of the kitchen staff about how disrespected we were by the wait staff. And it was a great experience. I really enjoyed the work. I also realized by the time I was finishing up that, I had friends in the kitchen who were approaching 50. And I was really like, I don't want to be doing this when I'm in my 40s.
How old were you at that point?
So I would have been, I guess, 25.
Okay.
Yeah, I turned 26 during that year while I was there. So.
And then how long did you stay in Kentucky?
So we decided about halfway through that what we wanted to do was go travel. So we basically lived on one of our salaries and saved the other one. And then
whose salary?
That was sort of just the theory of it. We just kind of we put half of what we were making away, basically.
Okay.
Neither of us were like our whole household income for that year was probably less than $25,000.
I can imagine.
But we had an incredible, I mean, we lived in an apartment in this old house in central Louisville that had, one time been this enormous mansion that had been broken up into like 9 apartments.
Mhm.
But I think, I mean, this was astonishing even for the time. I think we paid like $280 a month, and it included everything, like
Oh, wow.
electricity, water,
Mhm.
heat, because the
Mhm.
heating was all still centrally operated from
Mhm.
um, so yeah, we did that,
So you
we
wanted to travel.
yeah, so we decided to do at the time it was called Willing Workers on Organic Farms. I think they got into trouble by using workers in some parts of the world. So now it's called Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms.
Mhm.
The acronym's the same. Yeah, and then in March of 1995, we embarked on. I mean, we had some weird fly-by-night standby plane tickets. We went to JFK and just hung out for a day, and then got on some sketchy airline and flew to Luxembourg, and spent the next 6 months just traveling around Europe, mostly in France, but also Spain and Ireland and Belgium. Most, we'd take some breaks, but mostly working on people's organic farms in exchange for room and board. So it was a very cheap way to
Mhm.
spend a lot of time abroad,
Mhm.
um, and learn some French at that time. That was the language that we were um, trying to learn, and
Mhm.
um, yeah, so that was, and then after returning, um, Kristen went to do an apprenticeship at a timber framing company in New Hampshire, and I did another stint of teaching community college in Nebraska, where my extended family had moved, and I had a free place to stay. So we
Mhm.
were apart for a few months again, and then uh, she went back to Habitat in Louisville
Mhm.
for another um, a lot of 96 and 97,
Mhm.
1997. Um,
So
yeah.
since then, how many other times have you had to do something either because of Kristen or um
Yeah, I'm remembering your initial question was about our involvement with Habitat. So everywhere,
throughout the years?
yeah, everywhere I've lived since that time in Mississippi, I have volunteered for Habitat, uh, and actually met some really interesting people in Bloomington, Indiana, where I went to graduate school at Indiana University, um, and and then around here, Kristen has remained involved. She's led or co-led the Mother's Day build for women
Mhm.
here in Tompkins County. It's Tompkins Cortland County combined chapter. Gosh, going back well more than a decade.
Mhm.
Um, the boys have never really done like on-site swinging a hammer kind of work with Habitat, but we've made food for big groups of people to support them, in I think for this women's build in
Mhm.
particular. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Now, in all these years, how have you um intertwined history and your love for history with all these projects that you have been doing?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think uh, people who know me will almost sometimes roll their eyes at how I'm always thinking of like historical context for any place and anything that's going on, and asking questions, and so that's just sort of how my brain works, whatever I'm doing. But I certainly think that initial experience in rural Mississippi, and kind of having this moment of the veil pulled away, in terms of how far we still had to go in terms of creating a genuinely equitable democratic society. Um, as I noted earlier, I mean, that was a huge factor in me deciding to become a historian. I was like, this can't be the only place and context where we need to know more about what happened in the past in order to make some changes in the present. um,
Mhm.
I think that experience also, we lived in this community that was, as I said, almost entirely African American. and it was sort of environmental justice issues came to my consciousness because they do a huge amount of crop dusting of cotton at the time is what was grown there. And they sometimes wouldn't bother to turn off their jets of pesticides when they passed over the village because it was surrounded on all sides by enormous cotton fields. And I remember like the acrid taste sometimes of, it's like, wow, this is this is not right. And B, and I can leave here, and I will in a few months, or but there are a lot of people in places like this that have no way to avoid being subjected to this kind of barrage. So that definitely has influenced in some ways the way I try to center environmental justice, past, present, and future in my teaching in particular.
Can we go into that a little bit now?
Of course, yeah.
The kind of history you teach and the kind of history you're interested in now, what is it?
Yeah, so I'm in the area of history. It's a thematic subdiscipline called environmental history. And the simplest way to explain it is that until this subdiscipline sort of emerged, not surprisingly, at the same time as the environmental movement and activism of the 60s and 70s, non-human nature was sort of seen as this irrelevant static backdrop to whatever humans were doing. And it seems almost incredible to believe that now, but if you go back and you look through most historical accounts up until that period, that was indeed how things were treated, despite the fact that whether it's what we call natural disasters or pandemics or the impact of how humans have manipulated the environment, and then that has in turn really shaped human history. In some ways, our human interactions with non-human nature is absolutely fundamental to how the story of humanity has unfolded. So environmental historians look at that, and the big picture is what I described, but scholars take many smaller slices of that and explore them. The other aspect of environmental history is this idea that we talk about nature as though it's separate from humans, which of course it's really not. But nonetheless, different cultures at different times have had very different ideas of what nature is and the human relationship with it. So there's a cultural dimension to environmental history that looks at how the idea of nature has played out in different places and different times. And then my own work has ranged across a lot of different, my dissertation and some of the things that I published early in my career were on the history of the organized summer camp in the United States as a movement.
History of the what?
Organized summer camp movement.
Meaning?
Yeah, so it is a phenomenon that's not unique to the United States, although it started here and has developed most here, in which, going back to the late 19th century, people, this is the sort of elevator pitch version of it, but people began to become uncomfortable with the sort of urbanizing, industrializing country, and were worried about what would happen to children growing up in those environments. And so began creating these opportunities in structured ways and eventually at permanent locations of sending kids in the summer away for 2, 4, 8 weeks sometimes.
Away from the cities.
To these sleepaway camps where they would ostensibly sort of have encounters that would give them the values and aptitudes of their frontier forebears. It's very romantic. It's very often there's a racial dimension to it in the way it romanticizes Native American history and erases the genocidal aspects of that history. But by the middle of the 20th century, millions of children were experiencing this. Initially, it was just for elite children, and then it became for some small subset of of really underprivileged children, the idea being that, they would benefit from some fresh air. For example, the Fresh Air Fund is one of the organizations that started camps for that segment of the population. But eventually, all classes. And so my work was, no one had ever written a kind of comprehensive history of this movement and what it meant. And so that was my project. And interestingly, and then I've done other things which I can talk about if you're interested since then, but my published work is out there, and almost without fail, every couple of years, a journalist finds something and calls me for a story they're doing on summer camps, and they want to know some history. The most recent example of that was for the online kind of travel site called Atlas Obscura. I don't know if you know of it, but it's
no.
And the journalist who talked, I mean, she used my work pretty extensively in this piece, and also referred me to her agent. So a couple of weeks ago, I had this hour-long conversation with a literary agent that I'm still trying to figure out. I mean, she's very excited about me writing a book finally on this. And I don't know if that's how I want to invest my time, but I'm giving it, this could be, if you talk to me in a few years, this could be another yes moment, or maybe it'll be a no moment. I haven't decided yet, but it does feel kind of consequential, because I feel like there's a book there, and it's partly written based on the work I did. So anyway, that's that was early part of my work as a scholar. And, of course, I teach all of these things regularly. And then in more recent years, although it's kind of been in sort of suspended animation mode for a few years, I got involved with a project in Nicaragua with a community there that's been doing for a couple of decades some really interesting work with sustainable kind of grassroots development around solar energy. And so I did some participatory research, and then went back to Nicaragua on a Fulbright fellowship in 2017 to help them write their history. Basically, did interviews and kind of a local case study of environmental history in a particular place that has undergone enormous change since the the middle of the 20th century in particular.
Is this related to this communal kitchen and women? There was a project.
Yeah. So the Las Mujeres Solares, the collective in that grew out of these initial projects to do sort of artisanally fabricated solar panels that was being mostly done by men. And the women said, "This is pretty cool, but I bet we have a role to play here, and it can be a role that would help us, like, literally clean up our domestic environments." Because at the time they started developing these solar cookers, the most cooking was done on virtually open hearth stoves inside dwellings, and the smoke would just go up into the rafters and out through the tops of the I'm sure there are buildings like that from where you are from as well, because it's warm so much of the year that you don't have to worry about keeping the cold out, but it's not great for air quality. And so this co-op collaborated with a lot of different organizations to come up with a prototype that would be durable and practical for a tropical environment.
So they created what's the group called? A community? No,
a cooperative.
Cooperative.
Yeah.
That does what?
So they much of this is past tense. So the reason that my project has sort of been suspended is because, as I think you probably know, Nicaragua underwent some really challenging political upheavals in 2018, 19, 20. And then the pandemic, of course, made things challenging. And then since then, the Ortega regime has really cracked down on NGOs even. So
So
now,
what happened to them?
so it's not that they were not, you know, they were not singled out by the government, but the interchange that had been so vital to their organization of people coming from all over the world to learn from them, and they created a restaurant that was primarily using renewable energy, and did workshops with students on how to, you know, make solar panels and do agroecological restoration projects. Without that steady influx of people to work with, and also to make a little bit of income from, because you would, you know, they would host guests, and in exchange for that would get some funding. My conversation with the person I'm still most in touch with there, just a month or so ago, she said that it exists on paper still, but they're not active in the way they were. But for about 15 years, they were doing, they were not only building these solar cookers, but they were traveling around the country with them, and even into other parts of Central America.
Traveling around to teach people how to do it?
How to build them themselves, and then how to use them as a for cooking. And
So
yeah,
you were documenting their history.
yes. Yeah, both before all of these initiatives began in the early 21st century, but then especially, you know, how they had transformed especially the empowerment of the women was really profound in how they you know, had new roles in the community and in their households as a result of this work. It's a you know, it's a story to be continued. I'm working actually on a writing piece with Susan, the collaborator that I have in whom you may have met. They came
at your home?
Yeah,
Maybe.
she and Reina came in 2015, I believe. And we had a little gathering of people. We invited as many Spanish speakers as we could, so that they, especially Reina, would feel like she could.
Quick question on that. Now that you said that the roles of women change within the community, did that not create some kind of backlash from the men? Because I know in certain communities, also in Mexico, when things like those started happening, then the men would get very upset, and then they would become very violent with the women because they weren't used to having women making decisions or earning their own money. Or did anything like that happen over there? And if not, how did they negotiated that?
That's a great question. I don't know the full answer. I do know that I mean, as far as I know, there wasn't that sort of violent backlash. There was definitely some. I mean, I think part of it was because there were still clearly some separate spheres in the work that was happening. You know, the solar panel fabrication work was clearly a male domain, and then the sort of solar cooker, solar restaurant work was more a female domain. But I think I mean, partly it's because the economic opportunities in that area are so limited, that just having an opportunity to generate some income, even if it was episodic, was welcome. I mean, the reality is that, you know, the goal of the project ultimately was and is to make a viable local economy that can help staunch some of the outflow of people. But for now, you know, even before the political upheaval and the economic fallout from that, you know, people were, especially the young people, were leaving, you know, going to Costa Rica or Panama, or a lot of people went to Spain.
Spain?
Yeah.
Why Spain?
Yeah. Well, because you could make really good money in Spain, and it was easier to get to than the United States, even though most people would go and enter, illegally. And it's interesting, in Spain, most of the people in the village um, who went there were hired to do elder care, because
Oh.
it's one of these countries where there's a rapidly growing
Mm.
aging population and fewer young people. And so the people we knew who'd gone there were doing a lot of in-home elder care
Mm-hmm.
for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's still the case. I mean, things are changing so quickly in Europe also around immigration issues. But you could get regularized fairly easily, and then after 5 years, you could actually apply for citizenship. So a
Wow.
number of people we know from Sabana Grande have acquired dual citizenship now in Spain. Um,
Wow.
Although they're very, they report being treated very much as second-class citizens when they're there. Um, so
Yeah, and I'm sure they also get paid less than they should, taking advantage of immigrants working for less money than
oh,
they
for
would pay
sure.
to a
Yeah,
citizen. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, what's a
Okay.
but what I mean, that's the unfortunate reality of our global economy, is what's not enough money in a place like Spain or the United States is a lot back in Nicaragua. So, and I think something like 30% of the total income in Nicaragua is now from foreign remissions. Um, yeah,
That's a huge percentage.
huge. I think at one point a couple of years ago, uh, Venezuelans and Nicaraguans were the most frequently stopped people trying to cross the southern border of the United States. I think that has changed, but there was in the wake of all this political unrest, and just the economic crisis that it's produced, there was a lot of movement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So going back a little bit to your teaching, have you traveled with your students to do some projects, environmental projects? I kind of
Um,
have a sense that you have gone.
Not abroad or even away from Ithaca. I do a project with my U.S. environmental history class here in
Mhm.
Ithaca, where they do independent original research in the archives of the History Center here, and
Oh,
then in groups, and they do a case study of local environmental history. Some flood, or the development of the railroad, or the typhoid epidemic of 1903. And then typically they do a public presentation at the
mhm.
History Center on what they've learned, which is a pretty powerful learning experience, and it raises the stakes a little bit if you know that you're presenting to the public rather than just your classmates. Um, so that's the one. When I taught in the London program a few years ago, we did a lot of field trips in the city, in and around the city of London, that were oriented toward environmental history. But I've not yet. I once, what you may be thinking of is that I really did hope to create a short-term study abroad opportunity that would go to Sabana Grande.
Okay.
But the logistics of it and the risk management office here at Ithaca College are just so onerous that I've decided to invest my energy in other places.
um, I was thinking of how we began this conversation about, well, yeah, your professor, and then that led you to Habitat for Humanity, and then all the work you have been doing with history and environmental history. It's all within. It's like a broader definition of Habitat for Humanity. You're working now,
Mm.
the fact that you're interested in the environment and nature and how we relate to our environment is our habitat. It's habitat for us and
Mhm.
for all the beings that are with us in this planet. So you just took one experience and made it bigger and more encompassing by studying history.
Yeah, I like that framing. I have never really thought of it in quite those terms, but I sort of feel like whatever remains of my career in higher education, I do want to center climate aware teaching and learning, which of course includes there's stakes for human beings and stakes for non-human nature as well. I just, at the beginning of the summer, in early June, I attended a workshop in the Hudson Valley called Climate Wayfinding, which is an initiative from the All We Can Save project, which is grew out of a book by the same title, an anthology of what they refer to as climate feminism. There was such a powerful response to that the two co-editors, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkerson, decided to create some workshops to help community organizers and climate activists kind of come up, clarify the way forward in the work that they wanted to do. And so this summer, for the first time, they offered these workshops for people in higher education with the idea that that we actually then deliver these same workshops in our home campuses. So that's sort of the most prominent way, I think, in the next year I'm gonna have climate be at the center of things. I mean, I do anyway, but I'm gonna integrate it into my first year seminar, and maybe also do a standalone kind of long weekend course in the spring semester. But I think what I found most affirming about the way they approached it was that even though, this is hard stuff, right? I mean, there's ominous signs everywhere, but that there's also still joy everywhere, and that you shouldn't let joy and a sense of wonder about the world be your anchor, even as you venture into some stormy seas and trying to educate others and
I like that, because usually when we speak about the state of the planet, and it's so depressing, and one gets so bummed out that it's easy to go to the dark side and say, well, and this is gonna end, and what else can we do? Like, there's nothing, and then you end up not enjoying your life, not being active, not doing anything to change it. But if you switch it, if you do it like you are describing these women thought about, it gives me more energy just by listening at that option. I'm like, oh, I like that.
Yeah. And really the other piece of this is that there's no act that's too small, right? Like, I think some of us, myself included, often get almost paralyzed by thinking about, well, what can I do to help keep a Category 5 hurricane from happening in June, July, which is what just happened in the Caribbean. But that's the wrong scale altogether to be thinking about. You can there's small things you can do, even just like having conversations with people that are inviting and compassionate, but also small acts that in the scheme of things is the fact that we swapped out our gas stove for an induction electric stove a few months ago. Does it matter that much? No, but it does if you add all of these things up, right? So I think doing that with as many things as you can, with humility, that's you're not changing the world literally by doing something on that scale, but you're doing something, and every little thing matters. And I think for me also just changing this is the big task too, but it begins one conversation at a time. Changing the story we live by from one where we delude ourselves into thinking consumption is the path to prosperity and happiness, to pulling back and recognizing that it's, after a certain level of having your needs met, it's the things that make you content and happy in life are the relationships with other human beings, with non-human nature around you. And there's this whole movement to change the notion of gross domestic product as the measure of a healthy economy. And I think that that reorientation I'm talking about is a big part of that, right? Like, most of us don't want more stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to have to like do the things we need to maintain more stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, we all get on this sort of treadmill. So that's the project of decades, right? But I think, trying to get more and more people to think about how to choose to be lower level consumers
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing the benefits that come from that is an important
That going outside and
motive.
taking a walk and looking at the flowers, or
Yeah,
just a new branch in a tree that you pass by every day, can be more fulfilling and more better for your inner peace than going out and buying whatever. Yeah.
exactly. And then also again, most people report being actually happy when, after the panic of losing your phone goes away. You feel liberated for a while, right? Until
Yeah.
you inevitably replace it. But the other day, I don't remember, it was recently, within the last week, there were these amazing cloud formations in the middle of the day, and I was just in awe of them. And then I looked around, and almost everyone else was just like, phone in front of face, not looking up, not looking around. And so I think just paying attention is
Whenever I can, I point out to Maya the sky, the clouds, or if it's at night, whatever we can see that is new. Or whenever we go down Route 13, we say hello. Since we moved, we say hello to Lago Cayuga, to the Cayuga Lake. Like,
yeah,
hi, Lago Cayuga, good morning or good afternoon. Like, I made it a point to specifically remind her that there are all these beautiful things around us that if you forget about them and you just focus on whatever you see from your eyes down, you miss such beauty, you miss such beautiful things that are just free around you. So yeah. Okay, before going to the no moment, is there anything else you would like to say about this yes, this chain of beautiful yeses?
No, I think your framing of this project is interesting. I mean, just to contemplate, it was fun to think about all the moments in my life. I mean, it's not chosen at random, but I probably could have come up with two or three other ones that seemed very, and I think it's a good way of reflecting on one's life.
Okay. So now, Michael, let's go to the no moment. When was that moment in your life when you decided that saying no was a much better option?
um, I mean, as Kristen and some of my colleagues would say, I have trouble saying no.
Uh-huh.
And I get overcommitted as a result. That's just sort of in a day-to-day, year-to-year, month-to-month thing. I didn't give as much thought to that. And
Mhm.
I mean, there's some things that come to mind.
Okay.
One of which is that I was offered a tenure track position at another college before I was on a tenure track contract here. As you may know, for the first 6 years I was here at IC, I was
Mhm.
first on year-to-year ones and then 1 3-year one. And so in that period, I was always applying for jobs.
Mhm.
And at one point I was offered one. And it would have been much closer to my family back in Missouri in the Midwest.
Mhm.
But it didn't feel right for a lot of reasons. I mean, the institution was not nearly as um, big, or I would have been a one person in a department of two kind of thing, uh, and it didn't feel right, and it clearly wasn't right for Kristen. She said, well, I'll do what you want to do, because she knew that these you don't get offered a lot of jobs in our work, uh, and so that was a really important one. Another one that is, earlier in my life, I was offered a graduate fellowship that was much more generous to the University of Rochester at the same time that I was when I was pondering where to do a PhD.
For people who's not in doesn't know a lot of the academic world, what's a graduate fellowship?
Yeah, so graduate education, like all kinds of education these days, is quite expensive, and especially in a humanities field where there aren't particularly remunerative options once you get your degree. At least my perspective was I wasn't gonna pursue a PhD unless I could get funding that would help me do that. So most institutions offer fellowship to some portion of the graduate students that they admit. Typically that include all of your tuition is waived, and then some kind of stipend that's associated either with being a research assistant or a teaching assistant, or in some cases it's just a grant that allows you to pursue studies full time. So I was determined I was not going to go to a place that didn't cover tuition and offer me an assistantship that was at least enough to not have to borrow money. But again, it was sort of there was some prestige, obviously, to being offered this fellowship, and they were very generous to me when I visited. But
so what happened? What didn't you like?
Well, there were two things. One is that I knew that Kristen, that we would be very far apart. So this speaks to that enduring commitment that we've had. University of Rochester is where it was, and she was already working again at Habitat for Humanity in Louisville. And at that point, I didn't want to live in a city. I realized I had lived in some cities at that point, and for my graduate experience, I was much more interested in kind of a classic college town. And so a combination of that and the opportunities academically, as well as a reasonably generous assistantship, is what led me to Indiana University. But I remember how hard it was to say no, partly because when you've been courted like that, and it's very clear that they're excited and they'd like you to come. That's a hard thing to say no to.
So you don't regret any of these two no's you've mentioned?
I don't. No, I think they were hard in their own ways, and I had some doubts afterwards. Did I make the right choice? But
how long did that feeling last?
Oh gosh, it's hard to remember now.
But would it be
would
it have been days, weeks, months, years?
Probably weeks in each case.
Okay.
Probably for the graduate school one, not as long for staying here at Ithaca College. It wasn't like I didn't have a job either. If that would have been the only option I had to stay in higher education, I probably would have made a different decision. But I was just hopeful that things would continue to evolve here at Ithaca College. The other one, it wasn't until maybe a semester or two into my program that I was like, okay, this is the right decision for sure.
So you finished all your graduate education without debt? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but that was very intentional. I was very determined that that was a non-negotiable condition, in part because I realized I don't want to potentially carry debt for a degree that ends up being an end in itself. Like I wanted to hopefully get a job teaching at the college level, but there's absolutely no guarantees of that. And two is that I would go into it with that spirit that this is a great experience, graduate school. It's an incredibly privileged opportunity to be able to spend your days, thinking and writing and reading. And if the end of it is you get the degree and you have to do something else in life because the jobs in higher ed aren't there, that you need to be content with that, okay with that from the start. So while I had the aspiration of what could happen, I always tried to really appreciate that this could be it. This is, maybe I'll have a PhD in history and I'll end up being, a carpenter or who knows. I didn't really have a plan B, but I knew that it was possible. But yeah, I wanted to make sure that I was not burdened down by a lot of debt.
Is that something that your kids are also intentionally trying to do or thinking about
I think
in their own
so.
careers?
Yeah, I mean, that was very much we made that explicit to Samuel, our older son, who's at Ithaca College currently, that if he wanted to apply for college at other places and maybe get full ride scholarships, that he was welcome to do that. But that, we wanted our gift to him, if we can pull it off, to be he gets a debt-free undergraduate education. And I think he does appreciate that. It's been something that that I think, as he's about, he's probably going to finish a year early next year.
Wow, already.
I know, it's too fast. He turned 20 last month. So
oh my goodness.
But he's very interested in engineering. And it's likely that he will have to borrow some to do a graduate degree in engineering. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, unlike a history degree, if you have a master's degree in engineering, you're probably going to do okay with that degree in terms of getting a job that pays pretty well.
Okay. Well, very well, Michael. Any final words before we say goodbye?
Thank you for inviting me and for thinking of such a, like I said at the outset, I think it's just a wonderful legacy project, as a memorial, a kind of memorial. And I've kind of, I don't think I've watched any of them fully through, but I skipped around in a few. Some people I knew, some people I didn't, some in Spanish, some in English, and it's a great archive. I think it's a nice gift to the world that you're doing this.
Oh, thank you. My parents are gonna love that, to hear you say that.
Oh, good.
Well, thank you so much again for having said yes to this project. And now, final reminder, send me pictures.
Okay.
Whatever you feel comfortable sharing with the audience, send me pictures that I can add at the end of this interview. And thank you again, and have a lovely day.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. You too.
Say hello to Kristen and the boys.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're young men now, but they're still always boys too.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Bye.
Nos vemos.
Nos vemos. Bye.